It's all yours.
How do I get that up? Good morning. Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to bring up the question of consciousness, which has been kind of danced around. Not just intelligence. The singularity must confront the problem of consciousness. If we can get the slide up. So the title is The Consciousness and the Singularity, How We Can Get There. There it is. So consciousness. Let's start with, we have to start somewhere. Let's start with Descartes. There's a little gizmo on there. Oops. Can you guys fix that and I'll just keep talking? Thank you. So let's start with Descartes, who said, among many things, that consciousness, the contents of consciousness, are like a play on a stage with various inputs going into it to be observed by an audience. Of course, he got into trouble with that, saying that the observer was an immaterial soul, leading to dualism. But moving right along, in the 1960s and 70s, AI pioneers Simon and Newell, among others, developed similar brain-mind-computer architectures where inputs and the contents of consciousness were thought to be represented in a global workspace, a blackboard or a CPU. And later in the 80s and 90s, neuroscientists Bars, Edelman, some of these names have been transposed, sorry about that. A number of neuroscientists developed what was called the global workspace theory based on thalamocortical projections, that sensory inputs go to the thalamus and then to the cortex, and from that emerged consciousness somehow. And being represents conscious experience, awareness. But this is based on sensory stimuli and arousal, bottom up, top down. But much brain activity occurs without stimuli, for example, due to internally generated states, mind wandering, memories, meditation, daydreams. And Rakeley and Schulman and others have discovered default networks in the brain that are quite active when there's no sensory input, but when we are thinking and mind daydreaming, fantasizing, mind wandering, and so forth. So, and activity correlating with consciousness moves around the brain is the point I'm trying to make. Let's talk about what the brain does. Cognitive brain functions, sensory perception, behavior, learning, memory, and so forth, may either be non-conscious, as they are much of the time, and in that case they're described by Dave Chalmers, for example, as easy problems as opposed to the hard problem of conscious experience. Zombie modes, a zombie would be someone who looked like us but didn't have inner conscious experience, but we have zombie modes all the time for habitual processes, or the autopilot. So for example, I've noticed when I'm driving to work the same road every day, I'm driving perfectly well, but my mind is somewhere else, and then a horn honks or a light flashes and my consciousness returns to the task at hand. So consciousness kind of wanders around the brain. Now these functions can be conscious. The same functions I mentioned can sometimes be non-conscious and other times conscious. And Bing can move around the brain accompanied by an EEG signal called gamma synchrony EEG, which I'll get to in a moment. So moving and redistributing throughout the brain is consciousness. So the best marker of consciousness, not the fMRI, which gives us these beautiful anatomical illustrations but has poor temporal resolution, but EEG, particularly in the gamma frequency range. So if you get a bunch of squiggly lines, and it's broken down by Fourier analysis to these frequency bins that we all know about, and it turns out that gamma, 30 to 90 hertz, is the best marker of consciousness. Coherence in the gamma synchrony among different brain regions correlates with consciousness. For example, in this study by Dosberg et al., left visual cue from the left side of your visual cue gets referred to the posterior right occipital cortex, and after about 300 milliseconds of activity, there's a burst of gamma synchrony across the brain, throughout the brain, and at that moment, about 300 milliseconds, it seems to be where the activity correlating with consciousness occurs. In the study on anesthesia with many different anesthetics, front to back, F3 to O1 is like frontal to occipital, and it's this large bar here. It goes away as they go to sleep with anesthesia, loss of consciousness. It's gone when they're under anesthesia and comes back with return of consciousness. On the other side of the coin, higher mental states, for example, meditation in Tibetan monks who were studied in Davidson's lab in this study in PNAS a number of years ago, had the highest gamma synchrony, frequency, amplitude, and coherence ever recorded. Their control group was college kids who they taught to meditate for a few days. And they have a gamma synchrony, but not nearly as much as the monks. So how do we get gamma synchrony and how do we get consciousness? Well, here's a basic model of the neuron with the cell body and dendrites, which receive information, integrate to a threshold here, and then sends a spike to the next neuron by ion channels opening and closing. Here's the biological neuron here. Here's the artificial neuron. For example, McCullough-Pitts artificial neuron used in artificial system is very much like the perceptron. And this is a toy neuron that captures the essential features of both. And we have integrate and fire. Integrate in the dendrite, and fire should be moved over by the axon. So here's a network of these toy neurons with inputs on the left, outputs on the right, top and bottom. And with arbitrary synaptic weighting and inputs, we get patterns generating and input-output mappings based on this toy neuron model, which is basically the model that AI systems assume neurons to be. This type of neural computation can explain the non-conscious cognition that we talked about, that unaccompanied by consciousness. That is Chalmers' easy problems, the zombie modes, or the autopilot. That we can explain. If we think of a metaphor of an airplane that can fly on autopilot, where the conscious pilot can wander around the plane, maybe flirt with the stewardess or have a snack or take a nap while the plane's flying on autopilot, we can explain the autopilot, but we cannot explain consciousness. Where's the pilot? Where's consciousness? Where's the Bing? Where's the gamma synchrony is the real question. Because these types of neural connections, synaptic neural connections with chemical neurotransmitters, don't synchronize. It's like a continuous signal propagating through a network, and if you see the voltage spikes here, they're not synchronized. So there's no synchrony that comes out of this type of neural computation. Now, the EEG measures the postsynaptic dendritic integration, not axonal firings. This is a common misnomer, and a lot of people think action potentials or spikes or firings are the bits of consciousness or bits of neurocomputation. But it's actually dendritic integration that seems to correlate with consciousness. Now, a key point I want to make here is that there are two types of neural connections. Here's the kind we all hear about: an incoming axon, synapse, a dendritic spine, neurotransmitters released across this gap, binds to the postsynaptic receptor, integrated in the dendritic membrane. But there's another type shown here, which is dendritic, which is called a gap junction or electrical synapse that fuses neurons, synchronizes the two membranes, and it forms a continuous interior from one neuron to the other and a continuous membrane, actually, basically forming a syncytium of neurons due to gap junctions. To make a long story short, gap junctions, shown here if you're inside one neuron, looking across at another one, gap junctions between dendrites mediate gamma synchrony, which is the neural correlate of consciousness. So to show this, we have dendrites connected to each other by gap junctions. If they open, there's synchrony, and the stripes means that there's synchrony, and there's also collective integration. This type of sideways synchrony through gap junctions linked by is the source of gamma synchrony coherence in the brain, and it correlates with consciousness. So we see Bing going on with the dendritic synchrony. So if we have our network here and we open a gap junction here and it grows and evolves, we have a pattern, a representation that we know correlates with consciousness that moves sort of sideways through this network while the other computation is going on. So the other computation is going on and consciousness is happening inside this network. And gap junction connected dendritic webs can cross the brain. Evidence for this is that gap junction mediated gamma synchrony in the olfactory bulb correlates with conscious smell, Bing in the olfactory cortex. And for pleasure and reward, there's gap junction mediated gamma synchrony in the dopaminergic nucleus accumbens here, which is synchronized with the frontal cortex and amygdala. Here's the nucleus accumbens here. So gamma synchrony is the neural correlate of consciousness, and it happens through sideways gap junction connections, not the chemical synapses. Also, this kind of collective integration can be more efficient than integrate and fire of individual neurons. I don't have time to explain that. So to summarize so far, the conscious pilot is a model of, of dendritic synchrony moving through the brain, metaphorically like a computer worm, a ghost in the machine, the conscious pilot wandering through a plane on autopilot. Now, a comparable mobile agent or bubble of awareness has been implemented in AGI systems by Ben Goertzel, although he didn't talk about it at this meeting. And Mark Ebner in Tübingen is modeling pattern recognition with me, implementing this sort of model in a neural network. And I think consciousness may require a semi-autonomous mobile agent moving through computational networks doing otherwise non-conscious processing. But where's the Bing? Where's consciousness? Why would synchrony per se be conscious? So I think for that we have to go to a finer scale, and this conscious pilot model was sort of developed to accommodate processes that might be going on at a finer scale within the neurons that can transfer between neurons, perhaps by some kind of quantum processes, particularly processes going on in microtubules. Now, if we look inside a neuron, so here's a synapse here, two synapses. We have this structure, microtubules and microtubule-associated proteins cross-bridging, forming networks inside dendrites and inside neurons. And this is the structure of a microtubule. And if your microtubules fall apart, you get Alzheimer's disease. The tau protein that knits the microtubules together is defective in Alzheimer's disease, and if your microtubules disintegrate, you lose cognition and eventually consciousness. So Alzheimer's is primarily a disease of microtubules, although the amyloid plaques get all the money. So if you look in a network of microtubules can be self-assembled. This is the work of Hirakawa, showing the density of microtubules and how they can assemble and cross-bridge, forming networks inside the neurons. And I developed a model of information processing in microtubules, initially classically, where each of the subunit states can be two different conformational states interacting with their neighbors in a sort of cellular automata, and later developed a quantum model where they can be a quantum bit or qubit. But just thinking about the classical states for now, in the 80s mostly developed models with a number of physicists modeling Steen Rasmussen at Los Alamos and others, modeling microtubules as cellular automata, somewhat like the game of life that we see here. And the point is that based on these assumptions, microtubules have an enormous capacity for information processing. Something like this, over time steps switching in the megahertz region, so patterns and processing of information. So I want to digress for a moment into memory, because we have to understand how this level could communicate with the outside world. And a lot of work recently on memory has shown that in LTP, when calcium enters the cell, the key molecule is this CAMK2 snowflake-shaped molecule, which does something with microtubules and then gets distributed throughout dendrites in learning. And if you zap these, you can actually erase memories after they've been formed, as Sen has done in Atlanta. So CAMK2 is the molecule of memory, although where it is stored is not clear. So this is what it looks like. It's a beautiful molecule that, in side view, it looks like this. It's kind of flat. But when calcium comes in and memories are formed, it gets transformed, literally like the Transformer in the movies, with legs and arms coming out, we see on the right, into this sort of nano-robot. And this activated form is what correlates with memory. Well, my colleagues Travis Craddock and Jack Tuczynski and I realized that this was exactly the right configuration and size to map to microtubules. And in this work in progress, we show that activated CAMK2 fits perfectly with either the A lattice or the B lattice of microtubules. And so we think, and each of these 6 points can phosphorylate, so there's 2 to the 6 possible states, and this can be how memory can be imparted to the microtubules. And here's a nanorobot CAMK2 binding on top of a microtubule, transducing memory information from the synapse into the cytoskeleton. So again, we're talking about information processing at the level of microtubules of individual subunits. So what does this mean in terms of a whole brain emulation? Well, the conventional approach in the Singularity that we've heard this morning, although nobody showed these numbers, is roughly 10 to the 11th neurons per brain, 10 to the 3rd synapses, 10 to the 10 squared firings, 10 to the 16th neuronal level brain operations per second is the more or less target goal of brain emulation in the Singularity. However, if you consider microtubules, 10 to the 7th microtubule subunits, 10 to the 7 switches per second at megahertz, 10 to the 11th, we get 10 to the 25th brain operations per second. Now this sounds like bad news for the Singularity, and cue the lightning bolt coming down. But there's good news. and I think a shortcut to the singularity is that microtubules self-assemble. So we can have networks like this very easily, actually. The question is how to interface to them. And so I think this might be a shortcut to the singularity by just working with microtubules directly. Let me go back and say that in 1987 I wrote a book, and I concluded in that book, based on this, that nanotechnology may enable a mind-tech merger, such as described by Moravec and Sagan, information encoded in microtubule subunit states, and that people could choose to deposit their mind in such a place in microtubules. So I thought this was pretty crazy, but apparently not, because a lot of people, but I think we have to go down to this level of detail to get it. And I mentioned centrioles there. Centrioles are this structure, which are made up of microtubules, and they're found in all neurons in the brain. You see it here, these little green things sticking out are primary cilia coming out of neurons, and they're found in the stem cells and the ependymal layers, and also in the photoreceptors in the rods and cones. The light actually goes through these cilia to get to the photodetectors. And here's a cell, actually a fragment of a cell that has no DNA, no genes, just a centriole, and it goes towards the light. So I think AI people should try to simulate something like this before worrying about a whole brain. And the point is that this structure, these centrioles, is a perfectly designed, seems to be cavity resonator for photons. And this may be a way to communicate, especially using quantum optical properties, since there are a lot of properties of photons that are in the quantum realm, angular and orbital momentum, for example. So going back to this, we can still say, okay, where's the being? Where's consciousness? Well, Roger Penrose came up with a mechanism in 1989. He's not very popular in AI because it was a challenge to AI, but he basically said that consciousness depends on a physical process, a particular type of quantum state reduction by E equals h over t, which connected these quantum processes to fundamental space-time geometry. This seemed like a real stretch at the time, and still does to many. But Penrose and I developed this theory of quantum computations in microtubules, orchestrated objective reduction, in which each tubulin was a qubit, and communicating through gap junctions to other neurons. And so consciousness, in our view, is a sequence of discrete events timed to gamma synchrony every 25 milliseconds, each one of which is a moment, is a conscious moment. So this is our theory, like Whitehead occasions of experience. To summarize the current state of the model, we had 20 testable, even though it's been criticized severely ever since it came out. Recent events have validated it. There's been discovered coherent megahertz excitations in microtubules. The problem about decoherence that got a lot of publicity has been shown to be not a problem because there's now warm quantum coherence in photosynthesis and other biological systems. Topological quantum error correction, some very exciting conduction data coming out of Japan from Anirban Bandyapati, and the fact that gap junctions mediate neural correlative consciousness. So this is the most complete theory of consciousness. But you still might say, where's the being? Where's consciousness? Well, as I mentioned, Penrose connected this process, objective reduction, to both consciousness based in fundamental space-time geometry at the infinitesimally tiny Planck scale. Which we can't really see, but here's a couple of depictions of it from string theory or loop quantum gravity. So as I said, this seemed like a real stretch, and Penrose is not real popular in AI, and I'm not either. But here's some support.
We found the very fabric of space-time itself appeared to store information about every event which had ever occurred in the past.
So that's from the movie AI by Steven Spielberg, and if you don't believe Penrose and me, you can't argue with this guy. So conclusions. Interfacing, preserving consciousness, the singularity may require, number one, for artificial systems, a mobile self-organizing agent moving semi-autonomously through computational networks, the conscious pilot model. Number two, interfacing to brain-mind neuronal microtubules, cilia, and centrioles via implanted fiber optics, or non-invasively by photon echo of the retina. I don't have time to describe this, but I would put my money on this as a way to interface with consciousness, at least as an anesthesia tool, if not being able to read in and read out. And finally, artificial conscious media of self-assembling microtubules and so forth including centrioles, CAMK2, fullerenes, graphenes, duraquinones, may be capable of quantum computing via OR and provide a medium for consciousness. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Technically, we don't have questions, but maybe.
Yeah, thanks for that very inspiring talk. I'm Max Tegmark.
Oh.
Yeah, and after all the spirited discussions we've had over email and so on, it's a pleasure to get to meet you face to face.
So how do you explain the warm coherence in biology and other molecules? Because according to you, it's impossible.
Well, maybe we should have lunch. So my question to you is, in this space, we all want to know whether we have a quantum computer on our shoulders or whether we can do strong EI with conventional computers. And you've presented a fascinating array of possibilities for other types of computation and microtubules, space-time, etc. Now, my question is this. I think we both agree that if neurons and the neuron firings have anything to do with our consciousness, then decoherence destroys the quantum superpositions of our conscious states, and we can do it all with classical computers. So does that mean that the more stuff people discover the neurons can do, the more these other mechanisms have to sort of retract into a corner?
That's a fascinating question, but Stuart Hameroff does not have time to answer it right now. Thank you very much.